The walls have fallen. Smoke coils into the night, thick with the stench of burning timbers and flesh. You are no longer a princess, no longer a daughter of kings, only a trembling figure in the ash. Chains bite into your wrists as the Mongol horsemen herd you and others into the square. Horses snort, stamping the earth, their riders silent, eyes cold and calculating. One by one, the women are dragged forward, not by name, but by gesture, a pointed finger, a tug of reins. The choice is brutal in its silence. Who will live, who will serve, who will be discarded? You dare not speak. Around you, mothers stifle sobs, daughters stare blankly at the ground, waiting to be claimed. The realization cuts deeper than any blade. You are not seen as human. You are an entry in a ledger spoils of empire. From here, the story widens, beyond one night of fire. For the Mongol Khans, this was never chaos, never random cruelty. It was empire at its most terrifying, armies stretching from Korea to Hungary, cities razed, palaces filled with tribute. And yet, buried in the chronicles lies a darker truth, what awaited the captured princesses once the walls had fallen. If this descent into forgotten shadows grips you, subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It fuels more excavations into the past that history tried to bury. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest land empire the world has ever known. 1 in every 4 humans lived under its shadow. It was a force that rewrote maps, erased dynasties, and bent entire civilizations to its will. But what unfolded in the aftermath of conquest was not mindless savagery, it was policy. Chroniclers in Persia, secretaries in Yuan China, and clerks in Central Asia all recorded the same practices, the systematic fates reserved for royal women. For captured princesses, the terror was precise. They were not merely trophies, they were weapons, tools of domination, bargaining chips in diplomacy, and living symbols of humiliation. What may look like random cruelty in hindsight was, in fact, bureaucratized violence. An empire's cold machinery working against the most vulnerable. The battle was only the beginning. For the Mongols, the true work began once the smoke settled. Conquest was not measured solely in the bodies that littered the ground or the wealth looted from fallen palaces. It was measured in the human cargo processed with chilling efficiency. And at the center of this process stood the daughters of kings, the captured princesses whose fate was mapped not in whispers of chance, but in ledgers, rituals, and calculations designed to break entire civilizations. Contemporary chroniclers describe how, after a city fell, survivors were herded into public squares. Soldiers ringed the captives like butchers encircling a pen. The spectacle was deliberate. It was not enough to conquer a kingdom. The conquerors needed its people, especially its elites, to witness the dismantling of their dignity. Women were sorted first, and among them, the princesses were the most scrutinized. They were inspected in silence, their lineage known, their symbolic weight greater than any jewel. Imagine the scene, a mother clutching her daughter's hand, both dragged into the open. The daughter is of royal blood, her beauty renowned, her education refined. Yet in this moment she is reduced to a calculation, her body as collateral, her womb as a future battleground. Mongol officials recorded these assessments with the same detached precision used for counting horses or sacks of grain. Persian accounts speak of captives listed as females of noble stock, grouped by age and condition, valued like spoils. The sorting was psychological warfare. Families were forced to stand together as daughters were separated from parents. Husbands watched wives led away in chains, unable to intervene. A chronicler from Khwarezm described how men's eyes were bound not by cloth but by despair, for they were made to watch their own honor paraded from them. The Mongols knew this theater of cruelty mattered more than killing. It shattered hope, ensuring that resistance seemed pointless when the future itself was stolen. But why the obsession with princesses? In Mongol logic, royal women were more than individuals. They were living symbols of power, legitimacy, and continuity. To seize them was to seize dynasties. A Khwarezmian princess taken into the harem was not merely another concubine. She was a conquered crown, transformed into a tool for diplomacy or humiliation. Marrying her into a Mongol line erased centuries of lineage in one stroke, rewriting history as though the defeated rulers had never existed. These fates were not improvised. The empire ran on incentives. Commanders received rewards in proportion to the captives secured. Women of noble blood carried the highest value. Some were distributed as gifts to secure the loyalty of Mongol generals. Others were parceled out as diplomatic offerings to bind vassal rulers closer to the empire. And still others were claimed directly by the Khans themselves, who used royal captives as instruments of both pleasure and policy. One Persian historian recounts how a Tangut princess, captured after her father's rebellion, was paraded before the court. The chronicler's words are chillingly euphemistic. She was bestowed with honor, though her honor was not her own. In plain terms, she was forced into a union designed to erase her people's pride. The Mongols understood that a princess humiliated was a kingdom humiliated. The dehumanization was systematic. It began with the stripping away of identity. Captured princesses were forced to abandon their names, adopting Mongol or Turkic ones that signified their new ownership. Conversion ceremonies followed, mocking their former faiths. Christian princesses were baptized anew, but this time into servitude. Muslim women were subjected to rituals where their prayers were twisted into oaths of obedience. Archaeological evidence from Central Asia reveals remnants of structures that may have been used for these ceremonies, foundations of halls with restraints etched into the stone. They were not temples of faith, but theaters of erasure. Pregnancies were tracked with bureaucratic detachment. Surviving ledgers from Yuan China show calculations of lineage, noting which concubines had borne sons and which had not. Royal women were reduced to reproductive statistics. Their value lay not in who they were, but in the sons they might produce. Sons who could be used to bind conquered bloodlines to Mongol destiny. A captured princess who bore a child was sometimes elevated, her suffering repurposed into political capital. Those who did not were quietly discarded, their fates unrecorded. Transport itself was a horror. Captives marched across steppes, or loaded into caravans, became prisoners of geography. Horses and carts pulled them thousands of miles, often chained in groups. Mortality rates of 15 to 20% were considered acceptable losses. One Chinese record describes bodies thrown from wagons alongside spoiled goods, both noted in the same line of inventory. To the empire, a dead princess was a spoiled item, nothing more. Even survival meant unending trauma. Princesses who reached the courts of the Khans entered harems that were as much political institutions as places of pleasure. These harems were carefully structured, with strict hierarchies. At the bottom were the common captives, at the top, the royal women. But the hierarchy did not bring safety, it brought visibility. A princess's humiliation was magnified, ensuring that the memory of her lineage became synonymous with Mongol dominance. And this humiliation rippled outward. Families mutilated their daughters to make them undesirable, scarring their faces or breaking bones in the hope that Mongols would pass them over. Folklore across Persia and Central Asia preserves whispers of mothers who poisoned their daughters rather than see them taken. Better a death in our soil than a womb in theirs, one Armenian account declares. The trauma was so widespread that entire societies began reshaping themselves around the terror of abduction. Villages scattered. Families concealed daughters, and alliances collapsed as fear outweighed loyalty. Pause for a moment, this was not merely violence. It was a machine designed to grind identities into dust. The princesses were the most visible victims, but through them, entire cultures were broken. Their suffering was not incidental, it was instrumental. If the first blow was the battlefield and the sorting squares, the second was the long grind of systemic degradation. The Mongol Khans and their administrators did not leave the fates of captured princesses to chance. Every stage of their captivity was embedded in a structure of incentives, a cold architecture of exploitation that spanned continents. Economics was at the heart of it. The Mongol war machine thrived not only on conquest, but on redistribution. Captured princesses represented wealth in its most malleable form, human capital, that could be transformed into alliances, heirs, or symbols of dominance. Commanders who secured noble captives received prestige and rewards. Their shares were recorded in written registers with the same precision as taxes or livestock counts. If a general brought in a royal woman, his bonus might include greater autonomy or land grants. Thus, the suffering of one princess became a stepping stone for the ambitions of men clawing their way upward through the empire. But the Khans themselves were the greatest beneficiaries. Genghis Khan and his successors collected princesses as trophies of conquest. To possess the daughter of a defeated king was to prove not only military supremacy, but divine mandate. The chroniclers recorded these acquisitions with euphemisms like taken into the tent or brought under protection, veiling brutality beneath the language of honor. Yet beneath the poetry was a ruthless calculus. Every captured princess erased a dynasty's independence and replaced it with Mongol supremacy written directly into the bloodline. Some princesses were forced into marriages that served as living treaties. A daughter of the defeated Khwarezm Shah was given to a Mongol noble, her very existence binding her people's subjugation. Others were displayed as living trophies, paraded at feasts where conquerors drank wine while conquered royalty poured it. A Persian poet described one such scene. The wine was red, but the shame was deeper than blood. These feasts were more than revelry. They were political theater, reminders that no lineage, no matter how exalted, could resist Mongol will. The dehumanization deepened through forced conversions. Religion, once a shield of identity, was twisted into another weapon of humiliation. Captured Christian princesses might be forced to renounce their faith in public ceremonies staged for mockery. Muslim princesses were compelled to repeat prayers in alien tongues, their submission framed as both spiritual and political defeat. In the Yuan dynasty, records show elaborate rituals of renaming, where women were stripped of their birth names and given new ones symbolizing obedience. A life could be rewritten with a single stroke of ink. But the most chilling detail lies in the bureaucratic obsession with reproduction. Mongol administrators tracked pregnancies as if they were crop yields. Surviving records hint at women listed alongside notes of fertility and childbearing potential. This was empire by biology. Children of captured princesses were raised not as victims but as instruments of legitimacy, a mingling of bloodlines that allowed the Khans to claim dominion over both conquerors and conquered. To bear a son was to become useful. To remain barren was to become disposable. Transport to the centers of power was itself a crucible. Some captives were marched across the steppe, exposed to brutal winters and blistering summers. Others were loaded onto ships bound for distant courts. Mortality en route was high. Disease, exhaustion, and despair thinned their ranks. Chroniclers note that losses of up to 1 in 5 were accepted without concern, the dead discarded as spoiled cargo. The surviving reached the courts broken, their silence more valuable to their captors than their voices ever could be. The psychological warfare did not end at capture, it was reinforced in every humiliation. Princesses were deliberately displayed to their former subjects when possible. One account describes a royal daughter forced to serve wine at a banquet attended by envoys of her defeated people, her bowed head more eloquent than any decree of submission. The message was unmistakable: your sovereignty now kneels beside my cup. Families, driven to desperation, committed unspeakable acts to spare their daughters from such fates. Chroniclers in Armenia and Persia tell of parents who scarred their daughters' faces with blades or burned them with coals, hoping to render them undesirable to Mongol eyes. Some killed their children outright, grimly convinced that death at home was preferable to life as a concubine in a foreign harem. These stories, preserved in whispers, reveal the depth of terror that traveled ahead of the Mongol armies like a shadow, breaking resistance before the first arrow was loosed. What makes these horrors even more unsettling is how quickly they became normalized. Within a generation, entire communities had reorganized themselves around the inevitability of abduction. Villages hid their women, creating false walls and underground chambers to conceal daughters during raids. Songs and proverbs carried warnings that survival required invisibility. And yet, even these measures often failed. Scouts mapped villages not only for grain and livestock, but for the number of women of childbearing age. The empire's hunger was systematic, relentless, and planned. The Mongols themselves saw no shame in this. Chroniclers close to the Khans recorded these practices without condemnation, even with admiration. To them, The taking of princesses was proof of heaven's favor. One Chinese account speaks of how the daughters of kings bow willingly to the strength of the Khan, for it is the mandate of the eternal blue sky. Of course, this was no willingness. It was propaganda, the rewriting of suffering into divine inevitability. And so the cycle continued. Each conquest added more women to the rosters, more names erased, more lineages bent into the service of empire. The brutality was not random. It was methodical, cold, and woven into the fabric of Mongol governance. From the battlefield to the ledger, from the wagon to the harem, the fate of a captured princess was scripted long before the first wall crumbled. What may strike us today as unimaginable horror was, for the Mongols, a rational system. It combined terror with practicality, humiliation with diplomacy, violence with bureaucracy. And in this fusion lay their greatest power, the ability not just to conquer lands, but to conquer identities. Pause again and consider. The true conquest was not measured in cities burned, but in lives rewritten. For the princesses of conquered kingdoms, survival itself became a sentence. Their existence testified to the reach of empire, their silence a monument more enduring than stone. What began as smoke and screams in the streets grew into something far more chilling, a machine. The Mongol Empire did not merely conquer, it industrialized conquest. For the Khans, the fate of captured princesses was not incidental. It was the very engine that legitimized their empire, an unbroken cycle of humiliation and appropriation that ensured power reproduced itself generation after generation. At its core, this machine operated through cold mathematics. Scouts were dispatched months before campaigns, not only to map fortifications and rivers, but to record the presence of royal families. Reports were carried back to the Khans, noting which kingdoms sheltered princesses of marriageable age. This intelligence shaped the course of invasion. Armies were not just aimed at wealth or trade routes, but at wombs that could yield dynastic legitimacy. When cities fell, the captives were assessed with ruthless efficiency. Survival was never guaranteed. Chroniclers describe ratios so brutal they read like livestock tallies. For every 100 women captured, perhaps 10 would be considered valuable for concubinage, diplomacy, or alliance. The other 90 were expendable. Some were distributed as spoils to rank-and-file soldiers. Others were killed outright, their deaths recorded not as tragedy but as logistical necessity. In the cold arithmetic of empire, 9 of 10 could be discarded so that one might serve the greater design. And, for those who survived, captivity was not the end. It was the beginning of indoctrination. Princesses, stripped of names and faith, were placed at the heart of ceremonies designed to recast their identities. They were forced to participate in rituals that inverted the symbols of their culture. Armenian and Persian sources recall how royal daughters were dressed in Mongol garments and presented at feasts as though they had chosen their fate. The fiction was deliberate. By performing the role of willing consorts, their humiliation became propaganda, proof to the world that even the proudest bloodlines bent to Mongol will. The psychological toll was devastating. Consider the spectacle. A royal daughter forced to serve wine to her father's former generals, now broken prisoners at the feet of Mongol lords. To the Mongols, this was justice. To the vanquished, it was annihilation of memory. The message reverberated beyond the walls of the court. Word of these humiliations spread faster than armies, reaching distant villages before the first horsemen appeared. Entire kingdoms collapsed in surrender, not because of siege engines or cavalry charges, but because of the whispered terror of what awaited their daughters. This was psychological warfare on an imperial scale. To take a fortress was one thing. To shatter the spirit of its people was another. Princesses were made into instruments of despair, their very bodies turned into living proclamations of Mongol supremacy. And so, the machine perpetuated itself, not through constant violence, but through the fear of violence repeated across generations. Yet the empire did not stop at fear. It codified these practices, embedding them into laws and customs. In the legal scrolls of the empire, rape was reduced to property damage, punishable by fines rather than moral outrage. To violate a woman of conquered blood was not a crime against her. It was a minor offense against her new owner. This legal framing stripped the humanity from princesses and commoners alike, transforming them into commodities whose violation could be tallied like stolen sheep. By the mid-13th century, the system had reached terrifying sophistication. Marriages of captured princesses were carefully arranged, not at random but with strategic foresight. A daughter of a Persian king might be paired with a Mongol prince, ensuring that future rulers could claim descent from both conqueror and conquered. These unions blurred history itself, rewriting the bloodlines of Eurasia. To be born from such a union was to be a living monument to empire, proof that Mongol destiny had absorbed even the most resistant dynasties. This was the machine in motion: scouting, capturing, sorting, discarding, indoctrinating, breeding, legitimizing. Each stage reinforced the next. Each humiliation became a foundation for further conquest. And, through it all, the figure of the captured princess, once a symbol of sovereignty, was reduced to the empire's most potent weapon of psychological and biological war. The cruelty of this machine was not confined to private chambers. It was staged, displayed, and celebrated as public theater. Feasts became arenas of degradation, where captured royalty were paraded before the victors. Mongol lords drank from golden cups while princesses filled them, the silence of their humiliation more eloquent than any decree. Chroniclers describe how laughter rang through halls as defeated queens and daughters of kings stood in service, their eyes hollow, their presence a living reminder that no lineage was safe. These spectacles carried deep symbolic weight. By forcing princesses into visible servitude, the Mongols transformed conquest into ritual. Every guest at these feasts was meant to internalize the message: resistance was futile, submission was destiny. The degradation of one royal woman became a lesson for thousands of subjects. "Look," the conquerors seemed to say, "this is your fate should you defy us." Even the children of these unions were weaponized. Sons of captured princesses were raised in the Mongol court, trained as loyal instruments of empire. Their very existence blurred the line between conqueror and conquered, making it impossible for future generations to separate their identities from Mongol dominance. In many cases, these sons rose to positions of authority, ruling lands once held by their mothers' families, their power legitimized by the very blood that had been stolen. This was more than conquest. It was the rewriting of destiny itself. The machine's efficiency was staggering. Raids were scheduled like harvests, timed to coincide with the greatest availability of captives. Scouts mapped not only cities but populations, noting which regions might yield the greatest returns. Captured princesses were the most prized harvest of all, for through them the Mongols could claim dynasties, rewrite genealogies, and ensure that resistance was not only crushed but absorbed. And so, violence became normalized. Generations grew up in a world where the abduction and humiliation of royal women was not an atrocity, but a fact of life, a natural order sanctioned by heaven and enforced by horse and blade. Entire communities restructured themselves around this inevitability, reshaping traditions, songs, and stories to reckon with the terror. The legacy was chilling. What had begun as immediate brutality evolved into a systemic cycle that devoured not just bodies but entire cultures. Princesses once groomed to rule became pawns in a game of empire, their suffering recast as spectacle, their lineage transformed into propaganda. Pause and consider the weight of it. Entire kingdoms surrendered at the mere whisper of these fates. Whole civilizations bent their necks not at the sight of Mongol arrows, but at the fear of their daughter's humiliation. This was conquest perfected, not through endless war, but through the terror of what awaited after. By the time the empire reached its zenith, this system had become so embedded in Mongol governance that it ceased to appear monstrous to those who enforced it. Chroniclers close to the Khans recorded these practices with pride, their words celebrating what we now recognize as systematic atrocities. To them, the degradation of princesses was not horror, but evidence of divine favor, proof that the eternal blue sky blessed Mongol destiny. And therein lies the true climax of this story. The horror was not only in the suffering itself, but in its normalization. What should have been remembered as unspeakable was instead celebrated as natural, even glorious. Entire empires were built on this silence. Entire generations conditioned to accept that the fate of captured princesses was not tragedy, but the rightful order of the world. This is the revelation. The Mongols had perfected not only conquest of land, but conquest of memory. And that, perhaps, was the greatest terror of all. The dust of conquest has long since settled. The banners of the Mongols no longer flutter over Eurasia, their armies no longer thunder across the steppes. The walls that fell centuries ago never truly stopped collapsing. Their fates ripple through time in whispered folklore, in genealogies rewritten by force, in the silence of archives where ledgers of misery still lie. What makes this story unbearable is not only the scale of suffering, but its transformation into policy. Intimacy, once sacred, was weaponized. Daughters of kings were not spared by their lineage condemned them. To be royal was to be targeted, to be humiliated in ways designed to outlive them, ensuring that dynasties themselves bore the brand of conquest. Even today, echoes remain. Genetic studies reveal the imprint of Mongol lineage across millions of people, proof of unions forged not in love but in domination. Folk songs in Central Asia, Armenia, and Persia still murmur of daughters taken, mothers mourning, families broken. The cultural memory endures, unspoken yet ever present, a reminder that empires do not vanish cleanly. Their shadows linger in the blood, in the stories, in the silences that refuse to fade. But perhaps the deepest lesson lies in how swiftly the unimaginable can become normalized. What began as atrocity hardened into policy, then calcified into custom. Chroniclers wrote with pride of humiliations that should have chilled them. Courts applauded spectacles that should have shamed them. And entire generations grew up in a world where the degradation of princesses was as expected as the rising sun. That is the true fragility of civilization, the ability to bend human dignity into tools of power, to make horror ordinary when unchecked ambition reigns. To remember these women is to break that silence. To speak their stories aloud is to resist the empire's final victory, the erasure of its victims. They were more than names struck from ledgers. They were daughters, sisters, leaders whose humanity deserves restoration. By recalling them, we deny their reduction to footnotes in the chronicles of conquerors. If this history unsettles you, subscribe and share where it struck you hardest. We will confront the next buried shadow together. Because memory itself is resistance. And in the remembering, we restore what the empire sought to erase. For in the end, power unchecked does not merely take lives. It rewrites love, lineage, and memory into instruments of terror. To guard against that silence, we must remember, always,